We're counting down the 20 forgotten workshop tools every American dad kept in his garage in 1960. Tools that built backyard swing sets, fixed leaking faucets, and turned a Saturday morning into something a boy never forgot. From hand drills that needed no cord to oil-blackened stones that put an edge on everything. Each one tells a story of patience, pride, and a generation that fixed instead of replaced. Expect grease-stained workbenches, the smell of machine oil, and tools your father trusted with nothing but his own two hands. Which forgotten workhorse tops the list? Let's begin our countdown with number 20. Number 20, the push drill. Before cordless drills hummed in every garage, the Yankee push drill did the same job with nothing but a man's forearm. Dad kept his Stanley clipped inside the door of the tool cabinet, its chrome barrel worn smooth where his palm wrapped around it. You pressed straight down and the spiral shaft spun the bit, then sprang back up on its own, ready for the next push. It cost around $3 in 1960, and it drilled the pilot holes for every cabinet hinge and screen door latch in the house. Most models hid a magazine of drill points right in the hollow handle, so a man never had to hunt for the right size. Boys loved the satisfying click and whir of it, the way it felt like a tiny machine they could power themselves. It was quiet, it was honest, and it never needed charging. When the affordable electric drill arrived and then the cordless after it, the push drill slid to the back of the drawer and stayed there. Today, most people have never held one, never felt that spring push back against their hand, never learned that a hole could be made without a single watt of electricity. Number 19, the folding zigzag rule. Long before the steel tape measure snapped back with a clatter, a man measured the world with a folding wooden rule. Dad's Lufkin or Stanley lived in his back pocket, 6 feet of varnished hard maple linked by little brass hinges that had gone the color of honey. He'd flick his wrist and it would open section by section with a sound like dominoes falling, each joint locking flat and true. It cost about $1.50, and a careful man kept it for 30 years. The best ones had a brass slide that pulled out of the end for measuring the inside of a window frame or a drawer, a trick a tape measure could never do as cleanly. The numbers were stamped and inked black, easy to read in the dim light of a basement. Boys learned to fold it back up just right, never forcing a joint, because a snapped section meant a scolding. When the retractable tape measure took over, faster and pocket-sized, the wooden rule was quietly retired. Its soft click and warm grain belonged to a slower kind of work, the kind where a man took the time to measure twice. Number 18, the oil stone and oil can. In the corner of every workbench sat a small wooden box, and inside it lay the most important tool a man owned, even if it cut nothing itself. The oil stone, a flat slab of India or Arkansas stone, was what kept every other blade alive. Beside it stood the long spouted oil can of 3-in-1, ready to wet the surface before honing. Dad would draw a chisel or a plane iron across that stone in slow figure eights, the steel whispering against grit, the oil turning gray with metal. It cost maybe $2 and lasted a lifetime, slowly hollowing in the middle from decades of use. There was a smell to it, sharp and clean, that meant something was about to be made right. He'd test the edge against his thumbnail or shave a curl of hair from his forearm, and only then was he satisfied. Boys watched and learned that a dull tool was a dangerous tool, that sharpening was not a chore, but a discipline. When disposable razor blades and replaceable cutters made sharpening seem old-fashioned, the oil stone went silent. We throw blades away now. Dad would have called that a waste. Number 17, the egg beater hand drill. Named for the kitchen tool it resembled, the hand drill turned a crank and a set of open gears into a way to bore a clean hole anywhere, no cord required. Dad's Miller's Falls had a hollow wooden handle that unscrewed to reveal a tidy nest of drill bits and a side knob he steadied against his chest for the bigger jobs. It cost around $4, and the gears whirred with a sound that filled the garage on a quiet afternoon. You cranked with your right hand and guided with your left, feeling the bit bite into pine or oak, watching the shavings spiral up out of the hole. It was slow compared to what came later, but it gave a man total control. No slipping, no scorched wood, no torque wrenching the tool out of his grip. Boys could run it without fear of getting hurt, which is why so many learned to drill on one. When the electric drill became cheap enough for any household, the egg beater was packed away in a coffee can in the rafters. Today it turns up at estate sales, its gears still bright, waiting for hands that remember how to crank. Number 16, the spokeshave. A small tool with a blade between two outstretched handles. The spokeshave shaped curves no other tool could touch. Dad used it to round the edge of a stair rail, taper a tool handle, or smooth the leg of a stool until it felt right under the hand. It cost about $2, and it took a feel that came only with practice. The blade set just shallow enough to peel a whisper-thin shaving and no more. You pulled or pushed it along the wood, wrists turning to follow the curve, and the shavings came off in delicate ribbons that piled on the bench like wood-colored confetti. The name came from its oldest job, shaping the wooden spokes of wagon wheels, a reminder of how recently America had rolled on wood and iron. Boys were given a scrap and told to make it round, and they learned patience the hard way. When power sanders and routers made curves a matter of pushing a button, the spokeshave lost its place. But no machine ever gave a man that direct conversation with the grain, the way you could feel the wood telling you which direction to cut. Number 15, the draw knife. Older than almost anything else on the bench, the draw knife was a long blade with a handle at each end, pulled toward the body to strip and shape wood fast. Dad used it to peel bark off a fence post, rough out an axe handle, or take a fat board down to size before the finer tools came out. It cost around $2.50, and it demanded respect, because a blade pulled toward you punished a careless grip. He'd clamp the work in the vise, set his feet, and draw the knife in long, confident strokes, the wood curling away in thick, fragrant peels. There was something almost primal about it, a man and a blade and the raw timber giving way. Boys were rarely handed it young, and when they finally were, it meant Dad trusted them. The draw knife built the rough bones of a project the way a sculptor knocks away the big stone first. When power planers and pre-milled lumber made the rough work disappear, the draw knife became a relic. Today it hangs on barn walls as decoration, its purpose forgotten by most who walk past it. Number 14, the coping saw. A thin blade stretched tight in a deep C-shaped frame. The coping saw cut the curves a straight saw never could. Dad reached for it to follow a scrolled pattern, notch a piece of trim, or cut the inside of a shape by threading the blade through a drilled hole. It cost about $1.50, and the blade could be turned to any angle, so a man could saw around tight corners with surprising grace. It was often a boy's very first real saw, light enough for small hands and forgiving enough to learn on. And the projects it made, a wooden name plaque, a jigsaw puzzle cut from plywood, became the proud first work of many a young craftsman. The blade sang a high, thin note as it worked, and when it snapped, as it always eventually did, a new one cost a nickel. When electric jigsaws and scroll saws took over the curved work, the coping saw drifted to the bottom of the toolbox. Yet for fine, quiet, careful cuts, nothing beat the control of a hand guiding that slender blade through the wood. Number 13, the wooden miter box. Before the screaming power miter saw, A man cut a perfect angle with a simple slotted box and a steady hand. The miter box, often wood and sometimes cast iron, had precise saw guides cut at 45 and 90 degrees, and you laid your molding inside and let the slots steer the back saw true. It cost around $3 with a saw to match, and it was the secret behind every picture frame, every length of baseboard, every door casing in the house that met its neighbor in a clean, tight corner. Dad would mark his cut, set the wood snug against the back wall of the box, and saw with slow, even strokes while the guide held the blade dead straight. There was no guesswork, only patience and a sharp saw. Boys learned that a good corner was the difference between amateur work and a job a man could be proud of. When the powered chop saw made angle cuts instant, the wooden box was set aside, but it never kicked back, never threw splinters, never needed a cord, and the frames it cut still hang straight on walls 60 years later. Number 12, the plumb bob. Few tools were as old or as simple as the plumb bob, a pointed brass or steel weight tied to a length of string, and yet it was the final word on what was truly vertical. Dad pulled it from a nail by the bench whenever he hung wallpaper, set a fence post, or framed a wall, letting gravity itself draw a perfect line straight down to the earth. It cost about $1.50, and the heavier brass ones felt good in the hand, cool and dense and serious. He would hold the string against the top of the work and wait, perfectly still, for the bob to stop swinging and settle, and where that fine point came to rest was plumb. No argument, no battery, no calibration. There was a quiet magic in trusting the planet to keep you honest. Boys were fascinated by the slow, hypnotic swing of it before it came to rest. When laser levels threw a glowing red line across any room at the press of a button, the plumb bob became a curiosity. But it never lied, never died, and a man could carry the same one his whole working life. Number 11, the monkey wrench. Not to be confused with the pipe wrench and its biting teeth, the monkey wrench had smooth, flat jaws and a knurled screw in its throat that opened and closed them to grip a nut clean without chewing it up. Dad's heavy steel monkey wrench was the family fix-it tool, called on for the kitchen faucet, the radiator valve, the bolt on the lawnmower deck. It cost anywhere from $2 to $4 depending on size, and the big ones had real heft, the kind of tool that doubled as a hammer in a pinch. He would thumb the screw to set the jaws, snug it onto the nut, and lean into it while the wrench held firm. There was a whole language of these wrenches, monkey for nuts, pipe for pipe. And a man who knew the difference was a man who knew his trade. Boys learned that the right tool gripped without slipping, and the wrong one rounded off a nut and turned a quick fix into a long afternoon. When lightweight adjustable wrenches and full socket sets took over, the old monkey wrench grew heavy and quaint, but it gripped like a bulldog, and it never wore out. Number 10, the cold chisel. A solid bar of hardened steel with a beveled edge, the cold chisel was the brute of the bench, made to cut metal, split masonry, and break loose what nothing else could. Dad used it to shear off a rusted bolt, cut a slot in a stubborn screw, or chip mortar from brick, driving it with heavy blows of a ball-peen hammer. It cost about $1, and over years of pounding its struck end, mushroomed out into a ragged steel flour that a careful man ground back down before it could splinter. The ring of hammer on chisel was the sound of a job that refused to come easy, sharp and percussive, echoing off the garage walls. He'd wear his work gloves and turn his face, because flying chips of steel had no mercy. Boys were taught to respect it, to hold it loose so a missed swing wouldn't crush a thumb. When angle grinders and rotary tools made cutting metal fast and effortless, the cold chisel went quiet in the drawer. But when the power went out and the bolt was seized solid, it was still the tool that got the job done. Number 9, the outside and inside calipers. Shaped like a pair of bowed legs joined at the top, calipers were how a man measured the things a ruler couldn't reach: the diameter of a dowel, the bore of a pipe, the thickness of a turned spindle. Dad kept a set of spring calipers hanging by the lathe, and he'd open them to kiss the surface of the work, then lay them against a rule to read the measurement off. They cost around $2 a pair, and using them was a craft of feel, the legs set just barely touching, not too tight, not too loose, until the fit was exactly right. Outside calipers measured around a thing, inside calipers measured within a hole, and a machinist's hands knew the difference by touch alone. Boys marveled at how a man could match two parts perfectly without a single number, going by the drag of the steel legs against the metal. When digital calipers gave an instant readout on a little screen, the old spring calipers became museum pieces. But the men who used them could feel 1,000th of an inch in their fingertips, a skill no display ever taught. Number 8, the hand crank bench grinder. Bolted to the end of the bench sat a grinding wheel turned by a hand crank, and it was where dull things came back to life. Dad would clamp the work or hold it steady, turn the crank with one hand, and press a blade or a bit to the spinning stone with the other, sparks arcing off into the gloom of the garage. It cost around $5 to $7, a real investment, and it sharpened lawnmower blades, axe heads, screwdrivers, and chisels alike. The shower of orange sparks was a small fireworks show, and the grinding wheel filled the air with the smell of hot metal and stone. Cranking and grinding at the same time took coordination, often a two-person job with a boy turning the handle while Dad worked the edge. He dipped the steel in a can of water to keep it from losing its temper, the hiss and steam part of the ritual. When electric bench grinders made the second pair of hands unnecessary, the crank model was unbolted and forgotten. But there was a rhythm to that shared work, father and son, sparks flying, that no motor ever replaced. Number 7, the flame-heated soldering copper. Long before the electric soldering gun, a man joined metal with a heavy copper-tipped iron heated in an open flame. Dad would set the thick copper head in the blue cone of a blowtorch or gas burner until it glowed, then carry it, dripping with heat, to the joint, melting solder along a leaking gutter, a tin roof flashing, or a copper pipe. It cost about $3, and it took timing and nerve, because once you pulled it from the flame, the clock was running before it cooled. He'd swipe the hot copper through a dab of flux, the air sharp with the smell of rosin and hot metal, then lay a bead of solder that hardened into a silver seam. There was real skill in reading the heat, knowing when the copper was ready by its color alone. Boys stood back and watched the molten metal flow, learning that fire and patience could mend almost anything. When the electric soldering gun heated up at the squeeze of a trigger, the flame-heated copper became obsolete. But the gutters it sealed kept the rain out for decades, and a man who mastered it could fix what most people simply threw away. Number 6, the cobbler's last. Tucked under many a workbench sat a heavy cast iron stand topped with foot-shaped forms, and on it an American dad resoled the family's shoes rather than buy new ones. The cobbler's last, or shoe repair anvil, held a worn shoe upside down over the right size foot form, while Dad tacked on a new leather or rubber sole with a mouthful of small nails and a cobbler's hammer. It cost around $4, and in a time when a good pair of shoes was a real expense, it paid for itself by spring. He'd trim the new sole flush with a sharp knife, drive the nails in a tight curving row, and hand back shoes good for another year of school and church. The whole garage smelled of leather and shoe glue while he worked. Children grew up knowing their shoes would be saved, not tossed, that nothing wearable got thrown out while there was life left in it. When cheap, mass-made shoes made repair feel pointless, the cobbler's last went cold and rusty. It stands now as a relic of a time when Americans mended what they owned, and a worn heel was a thing to be fixed, not a reason to go shopping. Number 5, the tap and die set. Hidden in a fitted metal case lined with neat rows of hardened steel, the tap and die set let a man cut threads into metal. The secret art of making a bolt and a nut where none existed. Dad reached for it to chase the rust out of a stripped thread, cut new threads into a fresh hole, or rescue a bolt the hardware store no longer carried. A full set cost between $8 and $12, a serious sum, and it marked a workbench that belonged to someone who truly knew metal. Taps cut the inside threads of a hole, dies cut the outside threads of a rod, and turning them took oil, patience, and a feel for backing off before the brittle tool snapped. He'd thread oil onto the work, turn a half turn forward and a quarter back to clear the chips, and out of plain steel, a perfect thread would appear. Boys watched in something like awe, because it seemed like making something from nothing. When it became easier to just buy a new bolt for a dime, the skill faded. But a man with a tap and die set was never truly stuck, and he could repair what others would have scrapped. Number 4, the hand plane. Of all the tools on the bench, none was more beloved than the hand plane, and the Stanley Bailey jack plane was its king. Dad would set the iron just so, then push the plane down a board in one long smooth stroke, and a translucent curl of wood would rise up through the throat and drift to the floor. It cost about $8, a fine tool meant to last generations, its sole polished mirror bright from use. He used it to true the edge of a sticking door, flatten a warped board, or take a rough plank down to glass smooth. The surface left gleaming in a way no sandpaper ever matched. There was a sound to a well-tuned plane, a clean, shearing whisper, and a smell of fresh-cut pine that filled the garage. The shavings piled up, soft and fragrant, and a man could lose an hour happily in the rhythm of it. Boys learned to read the grain, to plane with it, and not against it, a lesson that took real time to master. When power planers and belt sanders made flat fast, the hand plane was set on the shelf. But nothing ever replaced the quiet pride of a surface made true by hand. Number 3, the handsaw. Before the circular saw whined to life in every garage, a man cut his lumber with a handsaw, and he owned at least 2, a rip saw for cutting with the grain and a crosscut for cutting across it. Dad's Diston had a polished applewood handle worn to fit his grip and a long blade that flexed and sang as it worked. It cost around $5, and a good one, kept sharp and lightly oiled against rust, lasted a lifetime and then passed to his son. He'd mark his line, start the cut with a few short pulls to set the kerf, then settle into long, full strokes, the saw finding its rhythm, sawdust drifting down in a steady fall. Teaching a boy to cut straight to a line was a rite of passage, equal parts patience and pride, and the first board cut true was never forgotten. The whole job was quiet enough to talk over. No roar, no cord, no guard. When the circular saw made cutting fast and loud and effortless, the handsaw was hung on the wall, but the men who mastered it could cut a line as straight as any machine, and they made the cut in peace. Number 2, the bench vise. Bolted to the corner of the workbench and weighing a small fortune in cast iron, the vise was the silent partner in every job, the third hand a man could always count on. Dad's woodworking vise gripped a board for planing, held a pipe for cutting, clamped a part for filing. Its big handle spun to tighten jaws that never let go. A good one cost $10 to $15, the single heaviest, most permanent fixture on the bench, and a workbench without one was hardly a workbench at all. He'd crank it down on a piece of work and lean his whole weight into the job, free now to use both hands while the vise held fast. It anchored the bench the way the bench anchored the garage, and the garage anchored a Saturday spent making and mending. Boys learned that you clamped the work first and worried about everything else second. As homework benches gave way to a buy it, don't build it world, the great cast iron vise lost the bench it lived on. But where one still stands, gripping a board in its jaws, the spirit of the home workshop lives on. Number 1, the brace and bit. And in first place stands the tool that defined the American workbench more than any other, the brace and bit. With its graceful, sweeping crank and its chuck that gripped a whole family of auger bits, the brace bored holes through the thickest beam with nothing but the strength of a man's shoulder. Dad's brace had a polished wood handle worn smooth by years, and he'd lean his chest into the head, set the bit's lead screw to bite, and crank that elegant curve around and around while a perfect hole opened in the wood. It cost around $5, with bits $1 or $2 each, and a full set rolled up in a canvas pouch was the pride of the bench. The ratchet let him work in tight corners, and the slow, steady turning gave a clean hole no electric drill could match for a true craftsman. Boys leaned in beside him, small hands on the crank, learning that a hole was made with effort and care, not just a trigger pull. When the electric drill arrived and the cordless followed, the brace was retired, hung on the wall like a piece of art. And art it was, the most graceful tool a man ever owned, the very heart of the garage that built America one Saturday at a time. From the humble push drill that opened our list to the graceful brace and bit at the very top, these 20 forgotten tools tell the story of a generation that fixed instead of replaced, that measured twice, and that taught their children the quiet pride of making something by hand. They are gone from most garages now, traded for cords and chargers and convenience. But the work they did still stands. Which of these did your dad keep on his bench? Tell me in the comments, and if this brought back a memory, you know what to do.